Chevre, hello, how are you? I hope everyone is gesund, stark, und freilich begashmis beruchnis. Hope everyone is healthy, strong, and happy physically and spiritually. Today is Erev Shabbos Kodesh Parshas Pinchas, Shabbos Mevorchim Chodesh Menachem Ov. Before we start the thought of the week, we'll begin with a prayer. And that is a pasuk from Kapitel Chof Zayin, a pasuk of Tehillim, which is connected to what we're going to speak about today. LeDavid Adinoi Oiri V'yishi Mimi Iro Adinoi Mois Chayai Mimi Evchod. David said, Hashem is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? Hashem is the stronghold of my life. From who shall I be frightened? Excuse me. So, we could also interpret this pasuk to mean not only fear of something physical, but fear of something spiritual. For a person who's a righteous person, or for a person who's a truth seeker, or in general serious-minded individuals, that issues of right and wrong are paramount in their life. So sometimes they have a question, what is the right thing to do? And that's a big problem. There's one problem a person might have in life is, even when he knows what the right thing to do is, to do it. And then there's another problem, sometimes you don't even know what's the right thing to do. So therefore, this is the request, this is the bakosha of David HaMelech, L'David Hashem Oiri. Hashem, be my light. I should have clarity. And then V'yishi, that'll be my salvation, because I'm going to do the right thing, which that's the most important thing, and that will bring salvation to myself and to others, etc. Which brings us to this week's Parsha, which I believe the themes and the issues that are discussed in this week's Parsha are especially relevant to our generation and our times. And I don't think we're going to do it justice in this short segment, because these themes are so epic and so large that it can't be covered in just 15, 20 minutes. What are those themes? Those themes are rebuke, criticism, engagement, etc. So, what does this week's Parsha talk about? It talks about Pinchas, who was rewarded for an act of zealousness that he did for Hashem. And the Parsha, Pinchas, starts off, Vayidaber Hashem o Moshe Leimer, Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen, Heishev es Chamasi, he turned back my wrath, Me'al b'nei Yisrael, upon the children of Israel, Bekanoi es Kanosi, when he zealously avenged my vengeance, B'soicham, among them, V'lichlisi es b'nei Yisrael b'kinosi, and he did not consume the children of Israel in my vengeance. So what happened was, as spoken about in last week's Parsha, Parsha's Balak, was that there was immorality that spread amongst the nation, and then came a plague as a punishment from Hashem. 24,000 people died, and then Pinchas did a very violent act, and that brought about that the plague stopped and the Yidden did tshuva. That was what happened at the end of last week's Parsha. And this week's Parsha, God says how pleased he was, and therefore Pinchas gets rewarded. And how is he rewarded? That all his descendants will be Kohanim. And also the pasuk says, I give him my covenant of peace. And as we'll see later, we're going to learn the Rashi, that in a way this Rashi, and even in the hinted to in the words of the Psukim, is really the answer to the dilemma. What is the dilemma? Now, when we speak about this Parsha, there's two sides. What I mean to say two sides is really, in Parshas Pinchas, if we look at the sermons and the talks of the Rebbe, usually in Parshas Pinchas, we're going to talk about the ideas that we need a Pinchas, someone who should take a stand, as we'll discuss soon. But there's the other side of the coin when it comes to rebuke, how careful you have to be, and how Chassidus Chabad in particular talks about it. So these are the two sides. When it comes to rebuking someone else, when it comes to mixing in to a situation, how do we know what's coming from the good side and how do we know it's not? So let's talk about the two sides. First, let's talk about how the Rebbe explains in many places, based on a mimer of the Tzemach Tzedek and Derech V'Tzesecha, Lo Yisevayru Eish, where the Tzemach Tzedek says, sometimes a person lashes out at someone else when they see something being done wrong, and they start screaming, Shkotzim, or throwing rocks, I'm paraphrasing of course, throwing rocks on cars, and going Givald, Givald, and they're making protest. But the question is it coming from your good side, or is it coming from a bad side? Is it coming out of your love of Hashem and your godly soul? Or maybe you in general have a bad nature when it comes towards others, intolerance, and therefore when you see the wrong in others, you immediately lash out. But it's not coming from a good place. You really have what's called midos mushchasos. You have rotten character traits. Now you found an outlet for your rotten character traits. So you can have a man cloaked in religious fundamentalism, and really he's just a rotten person. And therefore, the Tzemach Tzedek says, and the Rebbe brings it out in many places, before a person is going to criticize another person, he has to go through a certain checklist. And that is, for example, number one, you hate the bad that's in someone else. How much do you hate the bad which is in you? Oh, you're Mr. Perfect. What do you do in your life to improve the negative that's in your life? Question number one. If you're not at the same extent, at least, dealing with your negativity, how come you're lashing out at someone else's negativity? Question number two. What about the asay toiv in your life? When it comes to your tefillin, do you buy the most expensive pair of tefillin? When it comes to a mezuzah, do you buy the most expensive mezuzahs? When it comes to your kashrus, are you keeping to the highest standard of your kashrus? So that's another question. Don't only look at the negative, look at the positive in your life also, and see how well you're being careful on all those things that you're meant to be careful about. The answer, Omen Yehi Shmei Rabba, with all intensity, with all of kavanah. That's the second thing. And the third thing, triple check yourself. What kind of person are you? Are you in generally a very kind person, a very sensitive person, a very caring person, a very compassionate person? It's just that in this case, you're seeing something which is done bad and you want to help that person, so therefore you help that person. And you're not judging him. Because the first thing you have to remember, like it also says in this week's Mishnah, have mesulim badin, don't rush to judgment. And then we know, you really can never judge another person, etc., etc. So when a person looks at himself and he asks himself honestly whether he passes all those questions concerning himself, he won't rush to criticize somebody else. Now, even though we have on the one hand, I didn't mention this before, it's a mitzvah asay from the Torah, you should rebuke. Not only that, we see how important it is that the Alter Rebbe in his masterpiece, Tanya, chapter 1, he mentions the words, Kol mi, sheyesh biyodei limchais, ve'nei moicha mikarasha. If somebody can make a protest, a rebuke, and doesn't, then he is wicked. Because for the evil to prosper, all you have to do, as they say, is nothing. If you're not there and going to make a protest, a macha, then silence will just cause that the bad situation will continue. And then you are considered a partner in that bad. So on the one hand, we have this commandment, but guess what? As we come down to the all beautiful Vart, there's a code. There's halachas. Become baki in the halachas of make sure you know how to do it. Because here comes the other line, which is very, very true in many issues of Judaism. Like it says in Ayayim zwischen Kelt und Kfire is da dinah mechitza. Between coldness and idolatry, there's a thin line. There's a fine barrier. So you could say the same thing about many things. When it comes to rebuke, There's a very thin line between doing the right thing, where you know it's coming from a right place and a right cause, lishma, leman Hashem, and from a good heart, or whether it's coming from a bad place, it has nothing to do with Hashem, and it's just an expression of your negative character traits. So it's a dilemma, it's a question, it's not so easily answered. So that's one side of the coin, and it should also be addressed in Parshas Pinchas, even though in Parshas Pinchas, usually we bring up the following point, which is like the opposite extreme. And that is, we need a zealot. We need a fanatic, in a good way. A couple of years ago, I remember there was something, there's a lot of studies about this. It's called the bystander effect. What does it mean, the bystander effect? It originates, if I remember correctly, from a crime that happened in New York City in front of an apartment building. And there was a woman that was crying for help. And nobody in the apartment building came out to do anything. They peeked through the shades of the window, of the curtain, and that's it. So it was called the bystander effect, which means many bystanders have a nature that they just watch what's going on, passive bystanders. They become, disengaged neutrality. They just look at it from a distance, and they don't step forward. And they live with the dumb, mind your own business, that idea. So here we say that in many, situations, it's this bystander effect, which is the problem. We should create a culture where certain things are not stood for, are not accepted. I'll give you a simple example. Let's say in shul, you have certain people, they talk during Kriyas HaTorah. Whatever. It's hard for them to control themselves. We're not judging. But in general, that's what it is. Now, if no one's going to tell them anything, it's going to continue all the time and maybe get worse. Then you have a whole table of these people that are talking during Kriyas HaTorah. Now it's the Torah. Take on Hashem, respect for Hashem. Respect for Hashem's Torah. But how are you going to go about it? You're going to say shh and scream. You have to be smart. You have to follow the rules on how you go about it. As we said before, it's all about Shulchan Aruch. It's all about halacha. But nevertheless, it's clear that if we're going to have a bystander effect, it's just going to continue or get worse. Someone has to take a stand. And the more people in the shul that will take a stand that we don't stand for this, we don't tolerate, zero tolerance for talking during davening, then it won't happen in this place. They'll find another shul, but it won't happen in this shul. Because the person knows that in this shul, there's no talking. That's all. But how does he know that? Because it's made known to him. How? Because somebody was hichech techiach. In a nice way, in the proper way, v'chudu. So that's one environment where we see the idea of being silent just makes things worse. There's also in the culture of bullying, those that are in education know about it, that a lot of the problem with bullying in classes is that you have the bully and the rest of the class, doesn't want to stand up to the bully. And that's where the bullying continues, and the bully gets the message, he can get away with it. But therefore, kids are already educated. Of course, the teacher, it starts with the teacher, but even the children in the class have to be taught about not letting the bully get away with it, because much of the bullying happens when the teacher's not around, when they're by themselves playing. So only if the rest of the class will be educated that bullying is zero tolerance, and the kids, all the other kids, are brought up with this value that they'll make a protest, then it will stop. Otherwise, it will continue. Because the bully, by his nature, does that until he's educated otherwise, or shown that it will not be tolerated. So, this is the story of Pinchas. Pinchas, if we're talking about the lesson of Pinchas, so therefore it's Parshas Pinchas, we're going to talk first this idea. The lesson from Parshas Pinchas is that in Yiddishkeit we do have the idea of don't mind your own business. I'll tell you a story. My mother used to listen to the radio. I don't want to make the wrong impression. She was a tzidkari, she was a holy woman, she could daven in mincha for 20 minutes. But, she was a Holocaust survivor. She used to have the radio on during the day while she's cleaning the dishes, while she's walking around the house. So I don't know what she would have, talk shows. So one time I was home, and the talk show was discussing a Goyish song. And the Goyish song had the phrase, "I don't care what you say anymore, this is my life. Go ahead with your own life and leave me alone." So that was the punchline of the song. So my mother turns to me and says, "Wusser dus?" And the people of the talk show were saying, this is the kids talking to the parents of this generation, and they're saying, "I don't care what you say anymore, this is my life. Go ahead with your own life and leave me alone." So my mother was saying that the talk show was saying that the kids of this generation are telling their parents, "I don't care what you say anymore, this is my life." Oy vay. So she was like shocked. And she asked me, is that what this is all about? Anyways, what I want to bring out is that these words, in a way, tell us the whole problem. That the person today, the secular mindset, because people would like to do what they want to do, so they live with the concept of live and let live. And I don't care what you say anymore, this is my life. In other words, I want to do whatever I want to do. And yes, there's klipas, leave me alone. And leave me alone means leave me alone, number one, I want to do what I want to do. And leave me alone means I don't want to get involved. That's another point. You're ignoring it. There's a crime happening in front of an apartment building. You took a peek to see what's going on, but your attitude was leave me alone, I'm staying out of it. Comes along Parsha's Pinchas. 24,000 people are dying. And there's terrible immorality going on. So he goes over to Moshe Rabbeinu and he asks him what to do. That's what it says. Pinchas saw it and he remembered the law. And then he carried out the law. So it's not that he took the law into his own hands. Completely wrong. There's no such thing in Yiddishkeit. That's why the expression vigilante also doesn't apply whatsoever. This was the law. It's a halacha. And then he acted upon the law. And the only thing was that he was such a holy person that therefore it touched him so deeply that he remembered it and he was ready to have that Mesiras Nefesh to carry out something which is really opposite of his nature, an act of violence, so to speak, but for the purpose of peace. So the message of Pinchas is take a stand. On the other hand, as we said, we have all those restrictions or guidelines or principles in rebuke. No one should turn into the holier than thou preacher. No one should turn into Mr. Policeman. That's not your job. Your job is to love everyone. Your job is to embrace everyone. Your job is to be nice to everyone. But there are certain guidelines in how you're supposed to go about this idea of rebuke. And like I said before, this is so relevant in our times on so many levels. And we can't really elaborate. Number one, somebody once told me today, a very great educator, that today everyone is allergic to criticism. And it's true. It's like you went to the doctor and the doctor told you have a pimple on your nose and you tell the doctor, "You don't like me. I'm upset right now. You know why? You told me something negative." So you have to be very careful because that's what we're dealing with today. And we see from the Torah, you have to be super sensitive when it comes to criticizing. It's not criticizing. It's constructive criticism, and it's meant to bring betterment and improvement, but only if it's going to come from a sincere, loving place. Is it really what Hashem wants? Let's make that clear. So there's the concept of criticism. Constructive criticism. Then there's the concept of the zealousness and a fanatic. Today, many people like to use a word, and I really can't get into it right now. It's called balanced. Balanced. They look at this idea of balanced as being a virtue, and they have a source in the Rambam. But we have to define the terms. What does it mean to be balanced? I ask myself the question, when I think of all the heroes in the Torah, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Moshe, are we going to say they were balanced? Now, of course, balanced means, if you're going to say about this person, he was intellectual? No, because that's one extreme. Was he emotional? No. He's intellectual and emotional. Oh, That's called balanced. You understand what I'm saying? Or balanced. Do you know how to balance work and family? Yes, that's balanced. But when it comes to values and virtues, there's black and white. The Torah says, there's no balance. This is black and this is white. This is life and this is the opposite of life. So we have to be very careful. And therefore we have this example of Pinchas. All the heroes, you're not going to get any hero who is going to be defined as balanced. Why are you a hero? Because you did something out of the box. You did something unpredictable. You stretched yourself. It wasn't a balanced act. I'd like to finish with a story that I said recently, this year, that I heard about the Mashpia, Reb Mendel Futterfass. And I was so touched. It brought me to tears. I don't know if you will appreciate it because you're not Mashpian. This was the story. There's a younger man in our community, Reb Leibel Raskin. I would say he's probably in the neighborhood of 62 years old. Baruch Hashem, he's the city's sheikhet and a mashpia. So I was once talking to him about a Mendel Futterfass. So he tells me that a story that happened with him and Mendel Futterfass. What was the story? That one time he was in New York. Leibel was in New York when he was a bacher. So I don't remember exactly what year this is. This could be Lamed Hey. This could be Lamed Vav. He comes originally from England. He was then a student, a bacher in Brunois. And he went to the Rebbe for Tishrei in New York. So by then, Reb Mendel Futterfass is like already 65 years old. In the neighborhood, he's a mashpia. He's living in Eretz Yisrael in Kfar Chabad. But Reb Mendel Futterfass had also lived in England. Anyways, Reb Mendel Futterfass sees Leibel Raskin. So we're talking about someone in the neighborhood of 65 years old, a big mashpia, a big chassid, and a kid who's 15 years old. And he walks over to Leibel Raskin and he says, Leibel, the gehst rein auf Yechidus? He asked this kid, are you going into Yechidus? So Leibel told Reb Mendel, no. So Reb Mendel says, why? So Leibel said, I have no note from the administration, from the Anhola, from my Rosh Hashiva, from the Mashpia. You have to get a note, like a small report, to be able to get a Yechidus, a private audience with the Rebbe. Now, the reason he didn't get a private note, I imagine, is because Reb Nissen was the main Mashpia in Brunois. Maybe he didn't give kids that age, Bechlal, a note to go into a private audience. Leibel was then learning in Mesivta, which is high school. It's not Zal, it's not Besmeder, so he's a really young boy. And could be he was just out of the ordinary, out of the box, in general, out of the normal protocol to go into Yechidus. I don't know for sure. So Leibel told Reb Mendel that Hadnish can settle. So Reb Mendel says, don't worry, he'll arrange it settle. So Reb Mendel went to, I forgot his name, Fitchke Pevsner, maybe Fitchke Pevsner? Hilkel Pevsner, I think, who was a big goyen, a Rav, but at that time, he taught in the Mesivta of Brunois. So he got it settled from Hilke Pevsner, a note about Leibel Raskin. He arranged that Hilke Pevsner should write a note for Leibel Raskin, and then Leibel Raskin was able to go into Yechidus to the Rebbe, and that was his only Yechidus that he had privately alone with the Rebbe. So I was thinking about this story. Look at this story. Reb Mendel Futterfass is dealing with a boy who's not even under his jurisdiction. He's not his Talmud. He's from a different country. What is it Mendel Futterfass's worry whether this kid is going to have Yechidus or not? But because he knows the kid, he knows the family, he asks him straight up, are you going into Yechidus? Like, that's the most important thing in the world. And if I could make sure and find out, So, I can't think of another Chassidish Yid, another Mashpia, who'd even think in those terms. Other mashpiyim, Hasidic spiritual guidance counselors, they're into lofty thoughts. They're thinking about the mimer. They're thinking about how this bacher is going to improve in his davening, whatever it is. But only somebody who's an active a proactive do-gooder, looking how to help another person, is even going to think like that. And here, Mendel Futterfass, who was then the chief mashpia in Kfar Chabad, goes over to a kid, 15 years old, who's in another yeshiva, and asks him if he's getting a yechidus with the Rebbe, and then he arranges it. So, to me, this story was tremendously inspiring about, number one, always looking to do good. And that's what we're talking about today. The negation of the live and let live ideology. Yiddishkeit is not about live and let live. That doesn't mean you're a good person. To be a good person, you have to do good, not live and let live. You have to do good. Every single day you have to find avenues to express your attribute of goodness and kindness, and then do acts of goodness and kindness. Like it says in the Friedrich Rebbe Sichos, a tog was man tut nicht kein Teuve für a Yidden, it is nicht kein Tog. A day which you do not do a Teuve, a good deed for another, it's not a day. And this is what it means to be a fanatic. We need a fanatic do-gooder. We need a zealousness, a zealot of love, a zealot of kindness. Don't be balanced. Be extra, extreme when it comes to these things. Light, goodness, positivity, etc. The Eibusher should help. That by us acting all in the way of Pinchas. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to say this main point, but we're running out of time. So the answer to the dilemma, how do we know if you did it truly good or not, is from the first Rashi. What Rashi says over here, that the pasuk says, Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen, and Rashi explains there was a lot of criticism after what Pinchas did, and then Rashi finishes, Lefichu ba'akosav v'yechse acher Aaron, it mentions Aaron's name over here. In other words, Pinchas was acting in the spirit of Aaron. In other words, yes, we have to know for sure that it's coming out of love. So again, Pinchas is a man of love, a man of peace, and that's why the pasuk over here demonstrates it and mentions it. That's why he's rewarded with peace. That's why his children are all kohenim. Kohenim are all levarech Hasam Yisrael be'ava. And this takes care of the dilemma on both sides, where you talk about the principles and the rules of rebuke. So you have to check yourself to know it's coming from the right place. And are you a man of love? And therefore over here the Torah testifies that Pinchas is a man of love. And there's another commentator that I heard a good word, that even though the story of his act is in last week's Parsha, Balak, but in this week's Parsha, we have a new Parsha, Pinchas, where it says his reward. Why? Because we have to take a pause. When someone does an act of rebuke, or an act which seems to be coming from Gvura, we have to take a pause and we have to examine the motive. And that's the pause between Parshas Balak and Parshas Pinchas. We take a pause, we examine the motives, and we see that it was only coming out of love. And what was the love? The love to stop the Makeh for the plague that had already killed 24,000 people. Anyways, the Eibusher should help. We should all be zealots of love. And this Avas Chinam that we will have will bring about the Gula Mitzvah Shlema. Take it from a Yad Mamish, posting from my home, Be'ez Hashem Yisborech, your man in Melbourne.